Hello, this is Professor James Strickler, and this is a course in American government. This lesson is from Unit 4 about the legislative branch, and this lesson 13 focuses on redistricting. In this lesson, you'll learn about the need for apportionment, the purpose of the United States Census, the regular apportionment of seats in the House of Representatives, redistricting of seats in the House of Representatives, and the concept of one person, one vote, and how it affects the ideas of reapportionment and redistricting. In the United States Constitution, it says that the House of Representatives will be chosen every 2 years by the people of the several states. From that, we draw the idea that the House of Representatives represents those people of the states, and that the representatives in the House of Representatives will then be chosen by the people of those states. Now, that may seem like an obvious thing to say, but these ideas are critical for understanding what we'll eventually get to in this lesson. They are foundational ideas that have led this United States Supreme Court to interpret things in a certain way that will eventually influence the main topics of this lesson, reapportionment and redistricting. The United States Constitution then goes on to say that representatives will be apportioned among the several states according to their respective number. Now, the respective number that's being talked about here is the population of the states. So because the House of Representatives represents the people, its seats are apportioned, or in other words, divided up by in accordance with the population of those states. So in other words, a state with more people will get more representatives, while a state with relatively fewer people will get fewer representatives. Well, how will we know how many people each state has to make this decision of how many representatives they should get? The Constitution also says that there'll be an actual enumeration, in other words, a real counting of the people of the United States, and that it will be staged every 10 years. We know this counting of the people of the United States every 10 years is the national census, and it is done for this constitutional purpose of determining the population for purposes of apportioning the seats in the House of Representatives. Membership in the House of Representatives increased throughout our country's history until 1913. And after that, there was a feeling that the size of the House was getting too big, among other problems. If the House had continued to increase in size as it had up until that point, up until now, the present day, it would have over 1,200 members. But that didn't happen because in 1929, a law was passed by Congress that capped the size of the House of Representatives at 435 members. Now notice those passages we read from the Constitution at the beginning of this lesson. While they talked about the seats in Congress being apportioned among the states, it didn't say exactly how they'd be apportioned. And so it was left up to Congress to pass laws every 10 years after the census, establishing a new size for the House of Representatives and distributing the seats among the states. So in 1929, it capped the size at 435, and it's been there ever since. Now, because some states' populations grow more quickly than others, this process of apportioning the seats among the states now requires that they be redistributed every 10 years with only 435 seats available. Now, there's a consequence for this, and that is that when they're redistributed, because some states will be growing faster than others, some states are going to end up getting more seats and some less. We can see this on this map of how the reapportionment of the seats in Congress went after the last census in 2010. The states in green on this map are states that gained seats in the Congress, but because their populations had grown a lot. But because there's only 435 seats to go around, if some states gain seats, there's going to have to be other states that lose seats because their populations didn't grow as fast. So you can see on this map that the state of Texas grew the most quickly. And compared to the number of seats that it was entitled to in 2000, in 2010 it had gained 4 additional seats, while the states of Ohio and New York were entitled to 2 less seats each. So a way to look at it is those seats that New York and Ohio lost went to Texas. Well, this is required every 10 years to redivide up the seats like this because the number is capped at 435, yet populations change. So they have to be redivided up in a fairer distribution. Now, once the number of representatives in a state has been changed, such as by Texas getting 4 more seats, then the boundaries for the districts in that state, in other words, the areas where those representatives are elected from, are going to have to be redrawn. They're going to have to fit 4 new seats in somewhere within the state of Texas. This process of redistricting, or redrawing the boundaries in the states to make room for more seats, or to expand the districts because seats have been taken away in the cases of like Ohio and New York, is conducted by the state government. In most states, that's done by the state legislature. They draw their maps, they vote on them, that's how they decide how they're going to redivide the seats. Some states, it's done by an independent commission that's been created by state law. But ultimately, the authority still resides with the state government or with the people of the state through the process of them voting on how it should be done, to ultimately change it back to the state legislature if they wanted to. The main idea is that some way the state controls the redrawing of these boundaries and can, to some extent, draw them the way that they want. An example of this can be seen in the state of Utah and how its boundaries changed from 2000 to 2010 when it was given an extra seat in Congress. After the 2000 election, Utah was entitled to 3 seats in the House of Representatives, and it drew its boundaries in the way that you see on the left. In 2010, it was entitled to an additional seat, and it added the other district represented in green on the map to the right. Now notice that the districts remain the same, but the boundaries were transformed wildly. The district that is in orange remained the same district, with potentially the same person represented it between 2000 and 2010. But it essentially flipped and took over the other half of the state from what it had represented before. The same with the district in yellow. Nonetheless, this is how the state legislature in the state of Utah chose to redraw these boundaries. Now, there are some rules about how they have to redraw the boundaries, and those rules come from the United States Supreme Court. And they are based upon an idea that expressed in the court opinion cited on this slide. The Supreme Court, in this particular case, expressed the notion that for every person in the United States that gets to vote, their vote should count as one vote. In other words, the notion is that everyone's vote should count the same. Well, this has application to the idea of drawing boundaries for congressional elections, because if everyone's vote is going to count the same within these districts, then the districts need to be approximately the same size. Voters' votes wouldn't be counting the same if, for example, let's say you drew one district to encompass 90% of the population of a state, and the other district encompass only 10%. Then in one district, their votes would count 1/9 as much as those in the other district. So to make everyone's vote count basically the same, the districts have to have approximately the same population. Well, this requirement from the Supreme Court that all the districts drawn by the state legislatures for the congressional elections when they redistrict after a reapportionment, after a census, the Supreme Court's requirement that all those be approximately the same then requires all the states to redistrict after a census, not just the ones that have had the number of seats that they're entitled to changed. The reason the other states have to redraw their districts, even if their number of representatives have stayed the same, is because surely in 10 years populations have shifted somewhat. Some people have moved to other parts of the state, some parts have grown, some parts have relatively shrunk in population. And so if they just left the boundaries where they were, then they would no longer abide by this standard from the Supreme Court of every district having about the same population. So every state redraws its boundaries every 10 years after a census. So now let's review what we learned in this lesson. What is the purpose of the United States Census? Is it the reapportionment of the Senate? Is it for distributing federal money? Is it for arranging taxes? Is it for the reapportionment of the House of Representatives? According to the Constitution, the census is conducted so that the House of Representatives can be correctly apportioned. Well, what is reapportionment then? Is it the redistributing of House seats? Is it the redrawing of House of Representative districts? Is it the recalculating of tax rates? Or is it the redrafting of laws? Reapportionment is the redistributing of House seats. Remember, there's only 435. So as populations change, those 435 need to be handed out in a different way, with some states possibly getting more while others deserving less. What then is redistricting? Is it reopening treaty negotiations? Redividing legal obligations? Reassigning Senate seats? Or is it the redrawing of House boundaries? Redistricting is the redrawing of House boundaries. It's where legislatures have an opportunity to redraw the boundaries of their districts to make them better fit the population distribution in their country, in their state, as it has changed in the 10 years since the previous census. What does one person, one vote require? Remember, that's a standard handed down from the Supreme Court in its decisions. Although, interestingly, it does not appear in the Constitution anywhere. And prior to those decisions by the Supreme Court, it was not thought to be a constitutional principle that states had to actually abide by. So if their districts were disproportionate in their representation, that wasn't considered bad. So now I've essentially given away the answer, but what does one person, one vote require? Does it require all elections on the same day? Or does it require voter identification laws? Or districts of equal population? Or does it require that the Senate is unconstitutional? The one person, one vote standard from the Supreme Court requires that all districts have approximately equal population. Interestingly, it would seem to also say the Senate is unconstitutional, but the Supreme Court said, well, that's an exception because it's written in the Constitution. So that completes this lesson. Next lesson will be from Unit 4, and it'll be Lesson 14 about gerrymandering.